This grammar lesson is going to review some punctuation marks that are often misunderstood or incorrectly used, and that's semicolons and colons. Semicolons are sometimes thought of as a comma, but they are not a comma at all. In fact, they're kind of closer to a period because in this way, in the first way that they're used, they are actually used with independent clauses. Now, normally if we have one independent clause and then we have a second independent clause, that would be a run-on sentence. But if we added in a comma and a coordinating conjunction, one of the fanboys words that you see there, then it would be okay. But in this case, we can actually take out the coordinating conjunction and just put a semicolon in its place. And now what we have is two independent clauses that could stand on their own. We could have put a period and a capital letter, but we're trying to show the relationship between the two independent clauses. So we put a semicolon here instead. Another use would be to add a conjunctive adverb or a transitional expression. So you can have, just like in the last example, we can have a semicolon after the first independent clause, and then we could add one of those conjunctive adverbs that you see there. Now, once you add the conjunctive adverb, you're going to need to add a comma after the conjunctive adverb. You can also use a transitional expression instead of the conjunctive adverb, and you would still put a comma after it just like you did with the conjunctive adverb. So these are ways to make sentences kind of show the relationship of the sentences to each other or how they transition with one another. Now, another use of semicolons is actually as kind of a separator of the sections of sentences. So if you have a compound sentence and each section of that compound sentence has a bunch of commas in it, then you can show the separation of the parts of the sentence by changing the comma to a semicolon. It would normally have been a comma, but you're changing it to a semicolon to show the different parts. In the first example, there are two independent clauses. The first independent clause has a lot of commas, and so does the second one. And if you look at the conjunction and, right before the conjunction and, we've turned that comma, it would normally be a comma, into a semicolon to show where the first independent clause ended and then the next independent clause began. We have items in a series in the second example, and if we want to show how they're grouped together, you could see each of those items. There's a short story with an author in each one, and we're separating each short story and author by a semicolon instead of by a comma. Now, colons are different. They are meant to mean note what follows, and they are used after when we have lists of items, especially when we have the words as follows or the following. Here's an example. Prior to 1722, the Iroquois Confederation consisted of 5 American Indian nations. Now, the things that follow, note what follows, are those nations. And the same is true in the second example. We have the following women and a list of women following that. So it's used to mean note what follows. You're not supposed to use a colon between a verb and its complements or a preposition and its objects. So we have the emergency kit included. Now the verb included shows that's the verb, so it shouldn't have the things that it included, the complements of that verb, separated by a colon. Each student taking the math test was provided with, that one would be a preposition, and so we don't want to separate it from its objects. A lot of times people would use the word are. They would say the things you need to bring are, and then they have a colon. When you're not supposed to do that, you're supposed to just list the things you need to bring. You could say are the following and then put a colon, and that would be fine. Now you also use colons after a long formal statement or quotation. So use a colon between independent clauses when the second clause explains or restates the idea of the first. So when you have an essay and you write a sentence and the quote is going to be proving whatever you said in that sentence, then you are supposed to introduce it with a colon. Here's an example with, it's not a quote here, but it has an example of one statement proved by the second statement. So Lois felt that she had done something worthwhile, colon. Now what we should see next is the thing that she had done that was worthwhile. She had designed and sewn her first quilt. So that was a complete sentence followed by another complete sentence, but in this case it's kind of like the second complete sentence is proving what was stated in the first part. And there are capital letters in these complete sentences as well. You should also use it, of course, between chapter and verse in the Bible, between hours and minutes, between the main title and the subtitle, and also after you have a salutation in a business letter. that says, for example, to whom it may concern. All right, and those are our uses for semicolons and colons.